Every single season, pitchers make changes. This year is no different. So let's dig into 10 adjustments that starting pitchers and relievers have made that I think have the biggest impact on the rest of season projections. We'll start with a pitcher that I'm way higher on than the market. It's Will Warren of the Yankees. I first want to bring up a statistic known as Location Plus on Fangraphs. This is essentially our public proxy for how well do you command the baseball beyond just looking at something like pure walk rate. We assume it's maybe a bit more predictive than looking at something like walk rate. The problem with Location Plus is we don't have insight into like the guts of the model. So year over year, it's a bit cloudy as to why maybe a guy has swung up considerably. The reason I bring this up is that when you look at a leaderboard of Location Plus this season, the Yankees have 3 arms inside the top 5, despite the fact I don't think personally Will Warren, Ryan Weathers, or Cam Schlittler are plus command guys. So what I think is happening is that the Yankees are doing something in terms of how they're prepping their pitchers or throwing to certain targets that this model is picking up and saying, hey, they're commanding the ball really well, despite the fact I personally don't think their like finite ability to miss. Their location is dramatically better than if you look at the other 2 names on this list, Jacob deGrom and George Kirby, I would very much say are command type pitchers. What could the Yankees be hacking to get their pitchers to be this successful is a great question. I'm not positive, I think it may have to do with rubber placement. So if you look at Will Warren, the reason this circles back to him is that he moved way over towards the third base side of the rubber. So he has more of an extreme angle in terms of where he's throwing the ball this season. Now, I personally think of rubber moves almost as a location hack. So as opposed to playing with the raw angles of a pitch, sure, his sweeper backdoor to lefties is going to be sharper into the zone if he's throwing it from further towards third base. But if you look at some of his lefty locations specifically, this sweeper is more backdoor, the four seam is more up away, and he's also throwing more like front hip sinkers, which I find interesting. I think this is a byproduct of him moving on the rubber, creating weird angles, getting more called strikes on the sinker down in the zone. And the reason this is important to me is because if you look last season, he had an 8% K- walk to left-handed hitters, which is not good, below average. He's always had lefty problems. Some of these lower slot supinator types tend to have this issue. This season, he's up to 22% K- walk versus lefties. His ERA predictors are like around 3. Obviously, it's not going to continue, but his profile has always done really well against right-handed hitters. And now you layer in an angle that perhaps this rubber move has helped him versus left-handed hitters. We actually saw this with Nolan McLean as well. He's another extreme third base release point type. So that's kind of what my theory is here, is that Location Plus the model's picking up this location on the rubber specifically and almost thinking that it's command when it's maybe not necessarily actual ability to miss. It's rather just optimally where you're putting pitches is working better. And I think that Will Warren is a really good pitcher. If you're trying to rank him rest of season, I think the most aggressive projection system I saw had him like 85th in terms of Fangraphs WAR. I think he's more like 60th. So that's 20 spots above average, pretty solid. I'd say he's like 1.7 and 1.8 WAR rest of season. And maybe I'm underselling it. The innings pitch projection here is a little odd with Cole and Rodon coming back at some point, but I don't think he's going to lose a rotation spot. He's better than Gill. He's better than Weathers. Really fun pitcher who made a drastic adjustment here in terms of being able to combat lefties that I think is going to send his stock skyrocketing. Next up, we have one of the best, worst pitchers in baseball, if that makes any sense. If I show you Jesus Luzardo's strikeout rate, his walk rate, and his homers allowed, you would go, okay, is this dude pitching with a 2.5 ERA? What's going on here? This is amazing. What strides did he make this season? And then you look at the results and you see that he has a 7 ERA through 5 starts. Not particularly good, but his peripherals are so strong that it's hard to kind of reconcile what's going on here. The big thing I'll point out is that I do think he made some changes that are interesting. It's also important to look at how he's adjusted over the last couple of years. When he went to the Phillies, they started having him throw a sweeper. And generally, as I mentioned in a prior video about like this kind of pronation, supination bias concept, when you start ripping a bunch of sweeper and you're a guy who's more through the ball, as Luzardo was, you start to get around the ball more. So it almost bleeds into your other shapes. And we've seen this with Luzardo in terms of his four-seam fastball shape. But I don't think this is a bad thing for him because the sinker he's throwing has gotten a lot better. He's throwing it more this season to right-handed hitters. His changeup, he's kind of adjusted into more of a split grip, and it's dropping like 7 or so inches more, which again is a fantastic adjustment relative to the velocity trade-off that he underwent on that offering. So he's becoming more of like a lower slot, cut the ball lefty. And as a result of that, all his non-four-seam fastball pitches, I think, have improved in shape. And yet the results are like awful. So again, the BABIP here is through the roof. That's probably going to regress back. The left on base rate is really low, so that's obviously going to probably rise back up and not be an issue. unless you believe there's some like intangible psychological thing going on where he's just struggling in these spots to locate. But again, like the ball and play luck he's run into is so poor. I consider him, I often call this like a do you know ball test. Like before I tell you where I have Luzardo rest of season, think to yourself, Luzardo is a top X pitcher rest of season. I personally think that he's a top 15 pitcher rest of season, which is roughly where I had him prior to the season starting. It's kind of a hedge. I actually think that if he had good results, you can almost push him into the top 10, which is crazy to think. But I don't know. Is my number way off from what you just thought? Because he has a 7 ERA. But it's a classic do you know ball test. Do you want to go off the results and some of this oddity that we're running into where I have no idea if that's going to sustain and the data almost never says that stuff's going to sustain? Or do you bet on the fact that the underlying stuff is fantastic? And in my case, I'm betting on the underlying stuff being fantastic and him having poor luck. But his change as a pitcher has been fascinating. And I actually think like he's a better pitcher than he was last season when he was almost like a 5-WAR arm. So yeah, I'm obviously all in on this guy. I think he's one of the best arms in baseball. Let's go from Luzardo and the awful results, great peripherals, to a different kind of sphere where you have incredible results and good peripherals. That's Jose Soriano this season. So Mike Maddox comes over from the Rangers to the Angels and changes some things with this guy. The big thing is his forcing fastball usage. It jumped from 5% to 22% versus righties and around 12% to almost a quarter of the time versus lefties. Big change because this shape in prior seasons did not grade well. So essentially Maddox said, hey, I like this pitch that perhaps models don't love, and I want you to throw it more. It's more of like a behind in count weapon, but it's worked. It's worked really well. I'm not entirely sure if there's some interactive effects that Maddox has seen in his past that he was like, I think this will work. But there's also a subtle thing happening that I think is almost like a conflating variable alongside this, where he has also moved on the rubber, Jose Soriano, a little bit more centered. And again, versus left-handed hitters, we see some of his shapes. The sinker's a bit more away, the four seam's a bit more up. It's almost like that move on the rubber has also corresponded to a move and where those pitches are located over the zone. So you have a couple of things going on here that I think has allowed him to perform well. Rest of season, a little bit tougher of a projection because he's obviously not a sub-1 ERA guy. I don't even think he's a sub-3 ERA guy. There's just so few guys in the league that you would project to do that. You would essentially be saying he's going to continue to get really lucky on ball and play and some other elements for an extended period of time. I just don't see that happening. So I think he's very good, though. I'm definitely adjusting up my projection on him. Preseason, when I did my top 40, he was not in there. He was one of my like kind of first miss, I think. I think he was maybe like the 40 to 50 area. I got him more in this like 20 to 25 pocket. So Luzardo I have better. I just think he's a better pitcher. Jose Soriano has gotten really lucky, and I do think the improvements have worked. Just not entirely convinced that throwing this four-seam fastball, which is getting barreled a reasonable amount of the time, his ground balls are down. I believe his swinging strike is also not crazy different from the prior season. Again, I think it's all connected probably to the four-seam usage. But good pitcher. Is he a great pitcher? My answer is no, but I still think he's very good, if that makes any sense. Quick Substack plug for those who are not already subscribed. $5 a month, $30 a year. It's the primary way to support me if you like watching these videos and want a bit more of my content. Sometimes the stuff I write gets pushed into these videos, but if you're subscribed on the Substack, you're getting it far earlier and far more in depth than you are in these videos. So I encourage you to do so. I write about 5 to 6 days a week on things that I'm seeing that happened in prior night's games. I do some minor league stuff as well. A lot of that data is not public. So if you're interested in poking around on minor league guys, if you're subscribed and you DM me within Substack, I will kind of give you data that isn't public. So don't tell anybody that, actually. I think that might not be good for me. But anyways, it's okay. I got to do it for the sub. So yeah, anyways, check it out. I think you'll enjoy it. College pitching ranks are coming out at some point over the summer. I'll have a pitching prospect update as well. It's a cool place to be. Shane Baz is another tough one to project, and that's exactly why I'm bringing him up, because he made some changes that are interesting. The first one is last year, he actually flipped from a slider to a cutter. And now this season, he's throwing that cutter as his primary pitch to right-handed hitters. So it's kind of pulled down some of the four-seam fastball usage that he's used in the past. This has flipped his splits. So he, in the past, has been better versus left-handed hitters. This season in particular, he's actually better versus right-handed hitters, and he's running into a lot of problems with lefties. If you watch any of his starts, he's very sporadic in terms of his four-seam fastball location. So perhaps there's some underlying issue there that I'm maybe discounting slightly to the point where it could be to my detriment if I like him, which I do going forward. We'll get to that in a second. The other thing I'll point out, the curveball in zone hasn't been as good either, which is somewhat perplexing to me. I wonder if that's connected to the four-seam location, or is it connected to the changeup of his, which seems like it has changed. I saw a couple different orientations as I was looking through images of how he's gripping the ball. You could also see this just through the raw spin of the pitch, but in the past, this pitch used to be like an away pitch to lefties, and now it's more straight down in the zone. So I wonder if he's almost changed perhaps a little too much, and that has caused some issues versus left-handed hitters. The reason I think I like him, despite him being in a situation that is not good from like a swinging strike rate, and also an underlying data standpoint, like his xFIP isn't great and some of the CR numbers aren't good, is that I think there's multiple ways he can go. He threw a sinker last year to righties, which he's not been throwing. It seems like he's trying to fix this changeup, or at least playing around with it. That is positive to me in terms of solving some of the lefty issues. He could also go to a sweeper. So it'd be really weird if he turns into a profile that dominates right-handed hitters and is just kind of figuring out how to get lefties out relative to what he's done in the past, where the inverse has always been true. But I like the fact that this is kind of like a hotter take, I guess, is that I have him as like a 50 to 55 overall arm. I don't think any projections, again, going to have him around there. But I like what I'm seeing from the adjustments he's made, and he's not too far removed from left-handed hitter success that I think he'll run into a lot of issues. So this is a weird one in terms of, it's very easy to look at like Jesus Luzardo and go, this guy's going to be a lot better because the peripherals are good. I think it's far harder, and therefore I deserve more credit if I'm correct on this. If Shane Baz pitches very well rest of season, or say middle of May onward is really good, because none of the peripherals here line up. But I foresee adjustments here that make a lot of sense for him to get back to what he's done in the past, which is being a very good pitcher. Next up, we got Mitch Keller, who might be slightly boring, but he's a way for me to bring up what the Pirates are doing with their new pitching coach, Bill Murphy. I actually remember a couple hiring cycles ago, sometimes I'll occasionally get messages from people in organizations like, hey, do you have anybody in terms of who we should hire into various roles? Which I know I'm like kind of tooting my own horn here. I have no idea if any of the people I ever rec get hired, but I'm very specific with who I bring up. And someone mentioned to me if I had anything on this guy, on Bill Murphy, and I didn't, but his name stuck in my head, and I'm not surprised now to see him with the Pirates doing some really cool stuff. He comes from the Astros organization. The big thing we see right off the bat with him is that he has pulled back usage on a lot of smaller, shorter sliders. So there's a lot of names here. Carmen Modzinski, Bubba Chandler just added a sweeper. Braxton Ashcraft's throwing more curveball. Gregory Soto is not throwing as much of his short slider. Mason Montgomery has a curveball. And Mitch Keller has backed off his kind of bridge slider for more sweeper. That bridge slider for him went from 17% last season down to 2% this year. So essentially he's turfing all these smaller shapes and throwing bigger shapes, which maybe is not the best way to do it if you're prioritizing like pre-2 strike zone rate or something along those lines. But if you just want whiffs, I think they're doing a pretty good job of that. I think they're like top 10 in strikeout rate right now. And I think the major theme perhaps that he's getting at is like barrel suppression. If you look at a guy like Mitch Keller in the past, he's been more around average in barrel rate. He's down to like 2% this season, which probably unsustainable. Even like Framber Valdez and some of these other guys definitely have a skill in barrel suppression, or around like 4 to 6% or so in that window, which is really strong. But I wonder if that's kind of what he's hacking for. Maybe not necessarily like I want to hack for stuff plus, but I want to hack for barrel suppression. And I like it. I think it's kind of an innovative strategy. And he's done this with Mitch Keller in terms of flipping Keller from a changeup to a splitter as well as throwing more sweeper. So to me, although most projections are going to regress Keller to like the barrel rate he's always shown, I see enough in the underlying data in terms of what Bill Murphy has presumably changed with Mitch Keller to think that he can hold like a really low home run rate and end up with results that are going to kind of beat his peripherals long term. So he's a really high floor guy. I don't see much strikeout upside in particular. So he's more in this like 75-ish area in terms of pitcher rank rest of season for Fangraphs WAR for me. But I do believe that is slightly above projection again. And I like the changes he made. But I think some of these calls to make, a lot of the time, it's difficult to figure out what is not going to regress to normal for a guy. And that's why I like videos like this, because I can kind of put some shots up, on things that I'm seeing that I think are gonna beat projections, which is really all we're trying to do, right? Like you can't double count something that's in a projection. And I always mention in my videos, but adjustments like this, I don't think are things that projections are going to catch. So they're lower probability calls, as I kind of soapbox here in the middle of this video on why I like some of these takes that I'm bringing up. But I really like what Bill Murphy's doing. I think he was a huge upgrade over their prior pitching coach. And yeah, the Pirates are kind of interesting this year, which is fun. Who has been the most fun pitcher to watch this season on a start-to-start basis? The answer is Nolan McLean. This dude is unbelievable. Just the spin capacity he has and how much break his ball has is just visually something that I think I could even like show my mom and she would be like, oh, that's crazy. Look at how much that ball is moving. Is he playing wiffle ball? And I think that that's a testament of a good pitcher when you can communicate something to someone who maybe isn't totally interested in baseball and they care about it. So anyways, I have no idea if my mom has ever seen Nolan McLean throw, but I have seen Nolan McLean throw and he's sick. How do you get to this spin capacity? Is a very good question. I'm not entirely sure. This is something that if a team can solve it, they would have already solved it, because spin rate is like one of the main things in the draft cycle that people always bring up to me as like, we're trying to look for guys with that. You know, if they don't have massive outlier release traits or big velo, I need a guy who can spin the ball, because then I have more paths from a development standpoint to get him to good shapes. Is it torque on the ball? Is it finger pressure? Is it how the throw unwinds? That seems to be one that I'm talking to people and poking around like, hey, how do you get spin capacity? Seems to be one. The specifics of how the throw unwinds creating spin capacity is maybe a bit beyond my pay grade, but if I ever figure that out, I will circle back, probably make a video on it. Couple subtle changes here, though, from a location standpoint. That is my excuse kind of to talk about him, because I love him as a pitcher. So last year he came up, and his problem in the minors was lefties, which, again, very similar in a way to Will Warren, where you're like this low slot supinator type. You crush righties with sinker sweeper and whatever else you want to do to them. And then lefties, it's more like, I'm going to mix like 6 pitches 15% of the time, 10% of the time, and hope that you have no idea what's coming, and therefore in-zone contact quality is going to be lower. McLean came up last year through a bunch of breaking balls. This season, we're seeing more sinker to left-handed hitters, went from like 20% to 30%, and more four-seamer. So he pushed back to his fastballs, and the location of them has been really good, which is probably the main point that I find fascinating with him, is that he's held swinging strike rates, or actually, excuse me, they're up versus lefties and righties, and he's held zone rate alongside that, despite the fact the league zone rate, as I mentioned in other videos, has gone down a lot. So his ability to do that to me is like crazy, crazy good. Like this it's truly like number one pitching prospect territory, top 10 pitcher in baseball. If you're projecting rest of season, I think I have him more in like I think I had him right around 25, or I would have him right around 25, which is a bit up from preseason just because I like the changes. We're not seeing underlying data from a whiff standpoint, I think, to push him into the top 10. But if you're trying to find a pitcher who you're most confident in being a top 10 arm in a year, 2 years, it's got to be Nolan McLean. Just a really, really good pitcher. And I will point out the difference between, like, I don't know, let's say 50 and 75 in F-WAR, Fangraphs WAR ranks is like 0.3 WAR. And the difference between, say, like 30 and 20 is 0.3 WAR. So you could see how as you like ascend up and you start getting into this top 20 area, jumping a spot or two matters a lot. So the difference between putting McLean 25 and like 18 is a very big WAR swing. Whereas if you want to go on a Mitch Keller and say he's 50 versus 90, you're not really saying that much of a difference. Kind of a sidebar there. Nolan McLean is awesome. So the Astros were kind of desperate for pitching this offseason. We see that in the contract they gave to Amai, and they also got Mike Burrows. He was a pretty popular breakout pick in a video I did where I asked for your guys' breakouts. I wouldn't say he was the most popular name, but he definitely came up more than 4 or 5 times. I don't really like where he's at right now. He changed a lot with Houston. That's kind of pulled him away from what made him good with the Pirates. And I think my overall theme here is that it's going to take him some time to like reorient to what he's doing. So his arm angle is down 10 degrees. I believe this is one of the bigger drops in baseball this season. Start to start variance is usually between about 3 or 4 degrees from an arm angle standpoint. If you were to like plot, say, like Paul Skeens over the course of a season, the standard deviation there is right around like 3 to 4 degrees. So moving by 10 degrees is well beyond that. That's like, hey, you definitely changed something from how you're throwing the ball and your mechanics. He's stepping a little more crossfire. This is a nugget I got from someone else in an organization. So I think this is all connected. Like they have him moving a bit differently. He's a little more closed off in his throw. That's dropped the slot. He's aware of it clearly, and the Astros are as well, based on the usage. It's often my way to like confirm whether the team or the player's aware of something. Is just look at like what they're using. Sometimes when you see slot changes and stuff and decreases in performance, but the usage stays the same on pitches that are worse, I wonder if that's something where it's like, oh, we're not entirely sure what's going on here. We're trying to fix it. With Burrows, he went forcing fastball about 40% down to 20%. Sinker to righties, this is righties I'm talking, went from 10% to 30%. So he's clearly like, okay, the slot drop killed my four seam. Therefore, I'm going to throw much more sinker. I'm also going to throw more slider. Again, it's made him a little better to righties, but now he has a lefty problem because the four seam regressed, and it seems to have kind of jacked up his changeup. Think of Jesus Luzardo and the fact that his slot came down as a lefty, and he's now adjusted his changeup grip. I personally think as you go through different arm slots, there are orientations specifically that are more optimal for you as a pitcher. Burrows is using his old changeup grip from a lower slot. So my thesis here is that the changeup he's maybe thrown his entire life is not the grip or orientation that is optimal for him right now at this lower slot. I almost wonder whether he needs to move to more of like a split change to catch some more depth, regain his command of the offering, and allow him to be better versus left-handed hitters. But there's just massive changeup regression here for him that makes me think that this change is going to be inevitable at some point. The Astros have been good at making these changes. Think back to Hunter Brown adding a sinker, turning into one of the best pitchers in baseball. Right now, however, I think this is going to be a longer runway to get him back to being a very productive pitcher in a way where you can rely on him continually start to start. So I have him like 90 to 100 overall, which is definitely a kickback from where he was at the start of the season. I just think there's too much here that's going to have to adjust. Maybe a long-term buy, short-term sell, in my opinion, on Burrows. Taj Bradley's kind of a funny one. His results are fantastic, and I felt like I needed to bring him into this because if I didn't, I know he was going to be brought up in the comments. Really good results. I don't personally think there's too much different here in terms of his profile. We saw early season velo spike, and he kind of gave that back. But the big thing here is that he's combined things that he hasn't done prior in his career. A lot of what he's doing from a result standpoint, if you go back to 2024, looks almost identical to that. But he's just pulled down the barrel rate a ton. In the past, he'd always been a guy that gave up a bunch of barrels. So his barrel rate right now is below 5%, which is really strong. And also odd for a pitcher who has this vertical of a fastball. I often think you find those more vertical fastball types to be a bit more barrel prone on their four seamers in the zone when they miss location. He's got a 20% K- walk to, which is incredibly strong. Limiting the lefty barrels, as I'm kind of implying here, has been the key. Big thing he changed is that he is throwing more splitters in early count situations. So this jumped from like 20% up to 35%, and he stopped throwing so much of his cutter and his curveball in early count spots. That's really what I think has allowed him to be successful. And I think most people will say like, okay, your splitter is not a pitch you can command, therefore we're not going to try to bring it into early count spots because if the zone or strike rates there isn't good enough, then you turn into like Blake Snell without as good of stuff, so you're probably not a great starting pitcher. But I would argue anything that has a spectrum can be improved. Anything I think in baseball can probably be improved. Maybe not spin rate. As I mentioned with Nolan McLean, no one seems to know how to do that. But command of a pitch can definitely be improved. You know, like I think splitters are inherently lower command pitches, but Taj Bradley clearly has feel on his to be able to zone it as much as he is versus left-handed hitters. So anything can be improved, you know? And I think Bradley's gotten more comfortable with this split of his over time to the point where he can confidently zone it early count. So I believe a bit in the barrel suppression. The question here is like, how much do we have from a skills gain standpoint? He's still walking a lot of hitters. It's just he's pulled the walk rate up and the strikeout rate up enough, or the strikeout rate more than the walk rate is up. Kind of like a hitter who's swinging and missing more, but barreling the ball more. Taj is generating more swing and miss, but walking more guys, but the swing and miss jump is greater than the walk improvement such that he is in a pretty strong spot. He's a tough one for me. Is he top 40 or is he more like top 60, which again is only like a 0.4, 0.5 WAR swing, but I do think that's important to nail it in terms of his projection. I'm going to play Switzerland. I'm going to put him right in the middle in like the 45 to 50 area where I like what I'm seeing, but I don't think it's dramatically different from 2024 where he was in the range that I'm putting him in. So I'm basically saying he's like a slightly better version of 2024. Good pitcher, definitely improved from last season, but he's one that I'm fascinated to see how his season goes and whether at the end of the year we're like, we got duped by Josh Bradley again, or whether there was actually a skill gain for him zoning the splitter as much as he is versus lefties. Jansen Junk had some of the best command in baseball last season per Fangraphs Location Plus number, which I mentioned at the beginning of this video. And this season he went through like a stuff upgrade. And it's an interesting one because his slot came down, his extension came down. When you see that happen, you kind of expect a bit worse of a four-seam fastball, but that's not what we see. Because he started cutting the ball more, his velo actually ticked up, which you also don't see alongside more cut. And he added a bunch of vert and arm side movement. So you have a lot of variables here that are like moving in a very positive direction for his four-seam fastball shape. You would think to yourself, oh god, the guy who had crazy location now has great stuff. He must be one of the best pitchers in baseball. The funny thing is that his results look almost identical to what they were last year. So this is another one where like I like the underlying changes that just haven't borne out in terms of results. And I wonder if that's a byproduct of the pitcher trying to get a little bit more comfortable with the things that have changed. So you kind of have to open, I guess you can open like the third eye and try to figure out what's going to happen going forward with the Jansen Junk. The weird thing is that with the four-seam jump, you know, the kick change, he started throwing kick change, started spiking that finger on it. The feel for that pitch has gotten better. So he's been better versus left-handed hitters, but in a similar way to what we ran into with some other guys, he's actually regressed a bit versus right-handed hitters. I don't entirely know why. I think this is a locations thing. Versus righties, you'll see more in-zone slider and more in-zone four-seam. I would expect better stuff pitches to be good in zone, especially that four-seam fastball, but it's not entirely what we're seeing. So some oddity there. But again, I like a guy like this where in the past he's had success with a particular mix versus a given handedness. Now he's just a little bit different. and he's improved in some areas. So it's now a matter of like stitching the angles together. I feel like a lot of baseball, when guys change, oftentimes you'll see split movement in terms of how they're doing versus this particular handedness. And usually when that happens, you like give back versus the other handedness. I feel like there's some push and pull there. I don't know if this is backed up by the data. It's just kind of an intuitive thing that I think about a bit. And I think that's happening with jump. But given this isn't like a Mike Burrows change where it's like, oh my God, he's down 10 degrees. I don't think there's as much for him to like relearn from a throw standpoint to get him back to being successful versus right-handed hitters. So I like him. I think he's in a good spot. I don't know if he's anything better than like a top 80 pitcher, but I think I might be a bit low on that. Like maybe I have him more in like the 75 area. I like what he does from a shape standpoint. I think the Marlins are also going to be able to extract a lot of the value out of these peripheral arms based on how they call pitches and some of their modern approach to the game. Perhaps it creates more variance. Maybe he's like a roller coaster, but he's had some starts where he'll go into like the 8th inning pitching pretty strongly. And I don't think there are a lot of pitchers in baseball inside the top 90 that can do that, so I want to kind of front load him as much as I can and push him up into like the 75 area. All right, we'll close it out with a reliever. Let's go Devin Williams. As people have noted online, his changeup is very different than prior seasons, so it's harder and it has less drop. About 4 inches less drop is pretty considerable and has more arm side movement. The thing that I find most interesting here is that this happened to the changeup, okay? But his four-seam fastball, he seems to be on the side of it a bit more. So when I see a guy who gets on the side of their four-seam fastball more, I think to myself, oh, okay, that means the changeup will maybe have a bit more split action, where you're cutting it a bit, the seams are more involved, less arm side movement, more drop. That's not what we see with Devin Williams. My theory right now is it's because I generally think of like this pronation, supination spectrum as like, okay, directly behind the baseball, you know, and then you start to supinate and everything starts to cut a bit more. The four-seam maybe kicks up and vert and loses a bit of spin efficiency. I think that Devin Williams was so far pronated on his changeup release, if this makes any sense. If you watch him throw it, he's like all the way here on it. That naturally, if your four-seam fastball goes from here to here, you think your changeup would go from here to here too. But because Devin Williams is so on the inside of the ball, I wonder if for him cutting his changeup more means he's actually behind the changeup more. And that is why we see the velocity tick up and the vert kick up on the pitch, which is not exactly what you want. It's not as much of a distinct offering as it was in the past. Someone else brought up to me that he was throwing a bunch of sliders and cutters in spring. We talked about that bleed concept with Jesus Luzardo. I think that could be a reason, but if you think of Luzardo's timeline, it took him a while to get to that point. But this is how I interpret what's going on with Devin Williams, is like, he's cutting his fastball more. He seems to be more around the ball. It's just this changeup was so wacky that he's now behind his changeup as to being like cutting his changeup. If he was cutting this changeup, it might actually be a better pitch. Maybe there's an iteration of him that has like a split that he cuts alongside this changeup, and then you run into like the weirdest pitcher in baseball by a mile. But that's how I interpret a lot of people saying this pitch has less gyro. That's what I think we're getting at, is like he's more behind it. That's not good for his particular kind of changeup because of how outlier he was in terms of how he was throwing it. So I hope that makes sense. I do think we're missing a bit of the point where we just say Devin Williams' pitch has less gyro. Like, we have to understand exactly how or why that's happening. I don't think that's as like first principles of an explanation just to say the pitch has more gyro. It's like, okay, what changed in the throw to get this guy to be around the ball more such that it's getting more gyro? That's what I think what happened with Devin Williams. The timing of how he's pronating is different than it has been in compared to prior seasons. And for him, it seems like the changeup has had a really negative effect, or is negatively impacted by this change more than I would have suspected. So again, another tough one. This is another do you know ball test. Like, is he a top 10 reliever rest of season? There's only about 10 relievers right now to the end of the season that are projected to put up 1 WAR. And I think he's in that category. And I guess my assumption is here, I think this can change quicker, perhaps, than the Mike Burrows example I gave and some others. So, rambling here to close things out, he's a tough one. I think that this is a very unique case of changing the throw and changing an outlier pitch to not be as much outlier. He's going to have to relearn some things, but I still think I have him as a top 10 reliever. And at least the Mets hope he's a top 10 reliever because they paid for a top 10 reliever, so they better get that. Thanks as always for checking this video out. I thought this was a fun one, ripping through what I think are actually some of the bigger changes anybody's made this season. If I missed anybody, hit me up in the comments. I could try to jot down some notes on whoever you're thinking that I may have missed. But I think I got all the good ones here. So as always, thanks for watching. Subscribe if you haven't already. Check out my Substack. Share the channel with whoever you think might enjoy me nerding out on baseball like you have if you made it to all the way into this video very deep. I appreciate you. Take care.